This morning we want to look into a couple of different passages, actually. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 is where we'll begin, and then also over into James 4. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, they're in the Old Testament, just a little bit beyond Psalms, Proverbs, and then Ecclesiastes in chapter 3. I want to read the first 10 verses. It's kind of to some anyway, maybe if you've gone through youth camp or someplace like that, and that passage maybe has been used in a skit or something like that, you might be familiar with it. But it's the contrasting times, the time to do, for example, to laugh, or the time to weep, and so there's both sides of that, and we're going to look at those this morning, just kind of in a quick passing way, and then we're going to go over and focus on James 4. But I want to notice these few verses with you. Ecclesiastes 3, verse number 1. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down, and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to rend and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. What profit hath he that worketh in that wherein he laboureth? I have seen the travail which God hath given to the sons of men to be exercised in it. Just maybe pick up the first part there, verse 11. He hath made everything beautiful in his time. I like that thought as well. Let's go over to James chapter 4. James chapter 4 and verse number 13. Go to now, ye that say, today or tomorrow we will go into such a city and continue there a year, and buy and sell and get gain. Whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. For that ye ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. But now ye rejoice in your boastings. All such rejoicing is evil. Therefore, to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. I want to speak to you today on your life's accounting as we focus on this new year together. Let's focus a little bit, or think a little bit about the brevity of life, the shortness of it, and how we must be thinking about some of these things and sort of take account of our life. We'll look at several different aspects to time here today. Really, I think the new year is a good time for us to sort of consider the passing of time. Maybe consider a little bit about the shortness of life and how quickly this past year has come and gone, although it's been quite a year in many ways. But obviously, the COVID deaths have sort of kept that in front of our minds, or in front of our eyes, in a sense, that we do recognize the shortness of life. And actually, just while we were away here at the new year, I just shockingly discovered that a young man who was a part of my youth group at my first church, the first place that I pastored, and we had good times together. Enjoyed visiting with him. Just a good, friendly young man, but just unexpectedly passed away in his sleep. And you and I really have no guarantees. We have no guarantees of health, for one thing, especially these time or during this time, but also even life itself. We have no real guarantees to that. In our reading here this morning, Solomon is talking about a time for everything. And it has quite a list there, isn't it? When you start looking at all of these different things, there's a time to be born and die, and then all the way down through until there's a time of war and a time of peace. And so all of those different things, Solomon is talking about a time for those things. I don't really intend to focus on all these issues here, but Adam Clark commented on the first 8 verses there anyway, like this. He said, God by His providence governs the world and has determined particular things and operations to particular times. If we neglect the appointed seasons, we sin against this providence and become the authors of our own distresses. You know, really, I feel like people, to a large degree, have been focused in the last little while, focused on kind of where the clock of history is. In years past, I guess it was common to start talking about sort of the 11 o'clock hour, and we must be nearing midnight, the end or the close of Earth's day. I don't know whether that's true or not, but it seems very possible as things have sort of been developing and the evolving events in history and what we're seeing happen on the world stage or even in our own nation and even this week could be a critical one for life as we have known it. There's really a great divide in our country, and not everything that we hear sounds peaceful. But just think for just a moment, if we were to never meet again like this, if things just turned topsy-turvy and we weren't able to gather quite like this again, what would your life right now say about your destiny? If we were to look at your life, and we could kind of do an evaluation today, what would it say about what we would know in eternity together? Or would we be together? I want us to think about that a little bit here today. In the area of time, and I have several different aspects to time that I want to touch on for a little while, and I have some other scriptures, so if you just keep your Bibles handy, I'd like to draw those to your attention. The first one I want to touch on is what I'm calling abused time. Abused time. Acts chapter 24. Acts chapter 24 and verse number 25 gives us an example of that. Paul was giving his defense before Felix, and as you can imagine, Paul wasn't mincing very many words, apparently, in the area of truth. And so in verse 25, it says, and as he, that's Paul, reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, go thy way for this time. When I have a convenient season, I will call for thee. So again, this morning we want to touch for a little bit here on this issue of abused time. Except for maybe a time or two in the Bible, it doesn't seem that there's really much we can do about time marching on. Yes, we do have the example of Joshua, who called for the sun to stand still so that they could finish the battle, and it happened. A miracle back in the book of Joshua. Or maybe you would move on maybe and you think about Hezekiah and how the sundial moved backwards. Again, a miracle. It was especially as a sign for his healing. But except for those events, we don't see the case of time being well, really not adjusting for any man. We just recognize the wheels of time. I think that's the way we refer to it often. Just keep marching on, and we sometimes may feel like, oh, let's just stop for a little bit. You know, for example, I know many were ready just to be done with 2020, but it's a year past. We couldn't do anything about it. We'll never get it back. Each wasted minute is gone forever. We'll one day answer for it, but we can't redo it. We have to do whatever we can in the time allotted. And really, when we abuse our time, when we just sort of waste it, we're abusing another opportunity to do good. Notice back there again in James 4 where it says, therefore to him that knoweth to do good. Could I add there without taking away from the scripture at all, but could I just add there, to him that knoweth to do good in the time that he has, or maybe we would say, and doeth it not in the time that he has, to him it is sin. We must not abuse our opportunities. Now, it may be a chance to to maybe share Christ with someone. It might be, in fact, is maybe back up just a little bit. It might be even the chance to respond to Christ. That's what was happening there in Acts 24. Felix is hearing the message. He can understand all too clearly, apparently. Paul's reasoning with him on the truths of what it takes to please God and get to heaven. So he had that opportunity. Might be your opportunity today even to respond to Christ. Again, we've mentioned already, but I'll also say it again. Maybe it's to witness for Christ. Maybe it's to do good to your fellow man. Maybe it's trying to lay up treasures in heaven. And that comes into the area probably pretty much in the area of doing good to your fellow man. But as we treat others as we'd want to treat Christ, or as Christ would have treated them himself, then we are laying up treasures. We must not abuse those opportunities. And yet all too many are doing just that. I know sometimes we may feel like we don't have time for what really maybe ought to be done. But could I just remind you again that we have time for what we want to. So we have time for spiritual things like Bible reading or prayer, church attendance, or showing Christ to others. We have the time if we really want to do it. And yet too often we may abuse what time we've been given. And so God help us today. In our life's accounting, are we abusing our time? Not only abused time, but also the accepted time. 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse number 2. 2 Corinthians 6, verse number 2. For he saith, I have heard thee in a time accepted, and in the day of salvation have I succored thee. And that would be sort of to comfort or help you. Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. The accepted time. You know, really, I would suppose that most any offer that we know of, any opportunity that we know of, comes with an expiration date. Or maybe not a date, but, an understood time maybe. Of course, there's a number of examples of that in just our common life. Maybe we would, for those of you in school, maybe there would be the assignments that have due dates. You need to have this done by such and such a day. Maybe it's even in our bills. They come with, pay by this date, a due date. Even games really are for a limited time in many cases. Not every game, board game or something may not be timed, but a lot of common games are timed games. And so when the time runs out, it's over with. So why would we really expect life as a whole to be much different than that? Why would we expect that we can just keep pushing off the time and still be fine in the end? There's a due date. There's a time to be doing our business with God. Paul tells us that there's no better time to get right with God than right now. Now is the accepted time. Now is the day of salvation. Going back to Acts there, like Felix, sometimes we may wish to kind of push off. I'll tell you what, let's postpone that decision. Let's postpone that appointment, and whenever I have a convenient time, I'll call for you. And the general consensus, I suppose, is often, well, someday. I would say that almost everyone, if they know anything at all about judgment, about heaven or hell, any of those things, if they know something about it, their idea is not that I don't want it at all, but just that I'll come someday. I'll respond later. But too often, someday never comes. Too often, later ends up being never. And God help us to respond in the accepted time. So often God may deal with our hearts, and He prompts us and prods us. And if we resist, if we turn and procrastinate, do another thing, or just, say later, someday, whatever it may be, we may find ourselves wasting away our day of grace, missing out on the opportunity God has given to us. Just seems like that's been reinforced even more so lately. We've had all these, people that we know of even that have passed away just suddenly. Sometimes maybe COVID, maybe it's been a heart attack. Maybe we don't even know why. In case of my friend, I don't even know what took his life. But we're just being reminded of that. It seemed like all the more. And God help us, even today, to remember that no matter how unexpected the death, that does not give us a second chance or greater leniency just because it was unexpected, just because it was tragic. As Solomon says, there's a time to die. So we must do what's right even now. Now is the accepted time. The accepted time. Not only that, but we go on a little bit further and we notice the action time. Let's turn just a few pages here from 2 Corinthians and go to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 and 16. See then that ye walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. So let's look at that little issue there in fact, it's a big issue, but just a small statement there. Redeem the time. God wants us to be busy. We talk and we think about the coming of Jesus, but really, if we stop and think about it a little bit more deeply, how does that affect my life? Or what am I doing about that? Am I sharing the gospel? So often we're tempted to be selfish. Really, in a couple different ways, really. I mentioned already about sharing the gospel. And if we say He's coming, but we're not doing anything about it, do we really believe it? The other aspect where we're selfish sometimes maybe is that we're going after our own pursuits of comfort or riches or whatever it may be. And so sometimes we're selfish, not taking action while we have the time. Our text there in Ecclesiastes said there's a time to speak and a time to keep silence. And somehow or other, we almost get the idea that, we just always want to be quiet. At least as far as the gospel is concerned. We don't really want to get involved in sharing the gospel. But it's time for us to get vocal and get active for God. Before we just focus on the wickedness of our day, which is so easy for us to do, maybe we ought to ask ourselves what we're doing with the time we have to make any sort of difference. Going back to James there, are we doing good while we have the opportunity? If we know to do good and don't do it, the Bible tells us right there it's sin. So God help us. Yes, it may be a difficult day, but we must be faithful stewards. Is our time being wasted and abused, or are we active for His cause? It's action time. It's time to do what we can even now. Let me touch on one more, and we'll try to bring it to a close. In the book of Hebrews, in chapter 9, Hebrews chapter 9, verse number 27, and we'll get verse 28 as well. It's all in one sentence there. Hebrews 9, verse 27, and as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment, so Christ was once offered to bear the sins of many, and unto them that look for Him shall He appear the second time without sin unto salvation. Now, that verse 27 is sort of the hinge for verse 28, but I want to notice what it's saying there. There's a truth found there. It is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment. Death is not the end, but there is an accounting time. The last one today, the accounting time. Again, Solomon, as we mentioned earlier, said there's a time to die. We usually don't know when that'll happen. Some once in a while may at least have a pretty good idea. It's going to be in the next few hours or whatever. but mostly we don't know when that's going to happen. But we do know that we have to be ready. And this verse here says that there's an appointment with death. And after that, the judgment. There's an accounting time. A time to answer for what we've done. A time to answer for the way we've responded to the gospel. A time to answer for how we've dealt with other people. And so, yes, there is an accounting time. You might think it's nobody's business how you govern your time. But as we see here, one day we will give an account. Whether you don't have to answer to me. And I don't have to answer to you, at least in some measure. But we do all have to answer to God. There will be an accounting time. And that accounting ought to be forefront in our mind. I know we just touched on 2 Corinthians, but let's go back to chapter 5 and verse 10. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that he hath done, whether it be good or bad. There's an accounting day. There's a time for us to answer. If you come up short, one of the worst things about hell surely must be the memory of all the times that we could have yielded, all the times that we could have done right, all the time. Obviously, we're talking about time here at the beginning of a new year, but all the times we've had to do something good for God. Remember the accounting time. Don't one day look back with regret on lost opportunities at the accounting day. We bring it to a close. What are you doing with the time God's given you? Are you abusing those opportunities? Are you allowing God to have His way? Now's the accepted time. Now's the time to do right. We had no idea what 2020 was going to be like. Can you just think back for a moment? 1 year ago. What were we expecting? What were we thinking? But it's in the past. We got through it. At least those of us here today got through it. It may have been difficult. It may have been a challenge, but we did. But there are many souls who unexpectedly are in eternity today that were here last year. We have no guarantees. And so here at the beginning of a new year, the first Sunday in the new year, could I just urge you to use your time for God? Remember your life's accounting. It's time for action for God. It's time to do what He asks us to do. We need to redeem the time that we've been given, remembering that there's an accounting day coming, a payday someday. Now is the time to please God. Are you doing it?